boxes. And one of them is lifestyle and cultural. And then we had a bit of a look around art history, because when we look at craft work, we're making stuff. Art itself has quite a lot to say around craft working and also design. So craft working and design should be considered as kind of two separate entities and should not talk to each other much. But anyway, so the distinction needs to be made between how objects are made and the processes of making them. And the final output is the intersection between techniques employed, materials used, and working methods. So we've got a bit of a structure on how to physically create these outputs. And then we had a look at sociology, and sociology is generally where we find the craft working literature. So we find that people are motivated by a sense of craftsmanship tend to produce better outcomes than those purely motivated by material rewards or competition. And that craft itself should be viewed as an experience and an outcome of repetitive practice. And finally, that craft significantly should be extended to service industries such as hairdressing. So in contemporary understanding of craft, where we're kind of moving away from your coming out with physical objects because we use the word craft to identify lots of different, like to be the master of something. So when we're seeing it in hairdressing and photography and those types of things. So there is an emerging argument that craft should be extended to the services industry. Over to you, Cassandra.
Then we've got 3 different texts from the literature, from music. Doing Natal is an interesting article that looked at the motivation of musicians, what is their motivation, and so the intrinsic, their personal motivation versus external factors of motivation in order to create music, which created this idea of you do music for leisure or you do music for work, and so the different experience will determine what your music is for. Ruth Finnegan is someone who's very well known in the world of ethnomusicology, music and culture, because she did an ethnography on Milton Keynes and the musicians of Milton Keynes when she moved there to work. And she created a whole continuum looking at amateurs versus professional and how people were defining this with different criteria. And I've got some of them here. Some of the factors are social status, local affiliation also works as a determining factor, financial income, and also the musical level. But what she found out is that actually these were overlapping worlds, and that the amateurs helped the professionals and professionals helped the amateur worlds, and they were all interlinked constantly. And her conclusion is that actually there aren't amateur and professional musicians, they're just musicians, and it's really over a continuum who all work together. And more recently, Jens Zoulakis, who's in Belfast, he did an ethnography on musicians working in clubs in Greece, and then came up with this idea of work and play in music, work versus play. And the idea behind here is that when musicians consider music as work, then there's an element of hardship involved in it, which is very present in those clubs where you do it in order to gain money, but it's not necessarily a pleasant experience. Whereas playing music is when there's an idea of flow, of something that's very pleasant, of egalitarian music making, a feeling that you're on the same level as everyone. So it's really pleasure versus hardship, and here there's no concept of amateur or professional, it's just are you doing it as work, in which case there's this idea of it's difficult, or are you doing it for pleasure. And the same activity, playing in a band for example, could be viewed differently depending on what the outcome is. So kind of looking back to the motivations from Junior now.
So when we compared craft people and musicians together, you can see that their profile is very, very, very similar. The music industry is 3.1 billion, craft industry is 3.5 billion, the exports 5.8 billion, exports for craft people 5 billion. So you can see that the actual profile of their contribution is very similar, the amount of people employed is relatively similar, and also that their economic status is quite similar as well. So 78% earn less than 30k, 56% earn less than 20k, and 94% musicians work as freelancers. If you look at the craft person, then they're more likely to earn less than minimum wage, and 88% of people working in crafts are sole traders. So the profile is very, very similar. So what we're doing is we are positioning music as a craft with an immaterial output and using it as a vehicle to create this model. So we're using the context of music to help us understand the craft worker and how that can be applied to the wider craft worker literature. So this is our model. Over to you.
Yes, so we've got two different areas here which talk to each other. So this is flexible, fluid, so not one or the other. Basically, both of them have this output, which is the musical product, this immaterial output, and then we've got these three different elements that were determined by the art historian Rosati a couple of slides ago, where you've got techniques, materials, and working methods that all feed into to create this output. The main difference between the craft worker and the craft player, to borrow Yannis Tsoulaki's terms, is the idea of entrepreneurship, and that's what we think will determine the difference here between the person who is a worker or a player. And we've broken down entrepreneurship, but just to continue what this does is that for the person who doesn't have entrepreneurship as a goal or as part of their output, then their main goal is intrinsic and it's self-actualization. What they want is to do something that will be important for them. And so they're very much linked into the present and to the flow. However, the craft worker will have an extrinsic motivation, which is the market, and then this imagined future, always going towards this imagined future. And this idea of imagined future is something that's actually very important, because they're never actually in the present. They're always thinking, what's going to be the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. So this imagined future is what pushes them to have this idea of entrepreneurship.
Oh.
And so we looked a little bit closer at entrepreneurship. I think that's the next slide, yes. And in order to look at this, we looked at success. What is success, and how do you define success in music, but it could be for other outputs. And so this is putting together some different literature by Wilson and Al and Tsoulakis. And basically there's four main different aspects for a musician to consider themselves as successful. First of all, they have symbolic capital, which is, there are several different things that feed into that, which we'll see. Increased symbolic capital means that they have more work means that they have more security means that they get more income, and all these different factors feed into the idea of success, and all of these are areas of growth. And then we've got this idea of what feeds into this, and you've got the different kinds of capitals that are really important. So the human capital with experience, skills and intelligence. Both of these put together will allow people to identify the different opportunities that they've got in order to plan ahead, in order to be able to then increase these four different areas and be successful. And then what's really important is social capital, where you've got two different kinds of network, which are strong ties and weak ties. So the strong ties will be the ones that are close to them and the community, but the weak ties are the ones which will allow them to go into the wider labour network. And when we were doing this, what was really interesting is that we identified as this stage as where musicians are at risk of exploitation. This is in the strategic planning. Because what we were reasoning is that this idea of growth for musicians isn't just about making more money or making more music. It doesn't actually make sense. You can't make more music than you can. You can if there's a very big label and business model, but we're basing this on the freelance musician in the UK, which is about 98% of the musicians in the UK. So it makes sense to look at that rather than the big labels that might, focus on this. What's really important is the symbolic capital, and a lot of what the musicians will do is around symbolic capital. And in order to increase their symbolic capital, a lot of musicians and a lot of people who are in these kinds of professions will do a lot of things for free, but they don't do it for free because they just have a good heart, do it for free. They'll do it for free because they know that in the future, in this imagined future, it will increase their symbolic capital, which will lead to all these different things. And that is where people play with this and say, if you get this, then we will give you adverts and you will get more gigs and everything, which generally doesn't work out. And well, it happened to me quite a few times with BBC trying this on me. And Yanis Soulakis reasons that actually musicians are constantly in a state of crisis because they're constantly managing this idea of precarity that's very present in the profession.
About 2 minutes.
Yeah, and so this brings us to the last slide, I think.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so contributions then. So we're building on the emerging body of craftwork theory, which situates immaterial output as a legitimate outcome of craftwork. Okay, so we're using musicians as a way to demonstrate this immaterial output. But it also provides a more contemporary understanding of craft, but also it's highlighting this disconnect between the craft work and the artisan entrepreneurship theory. In that, particularly if you look around artisan entrepreneurship, success cannot be measured exclusively on variables such as employing people, income, and growth ambitions. It doesn't translate. And bigger does not mean better. So for musicians, it's about growing audiences, building symbolic capital, and the outreach of their output. So how many people get to listen to their work, how many people buy their work, etc. And flexible working particularly should not be confused with lifestyle goals. It's rather a necessity of precarious living. It's an outcome of their job as opposed to being something that they're actively pursuing. And it's because it's the sacrifice that they are making in order to reach this imagined future that they have together. And then finally... Yeah,
and just to finish, so we're extending on this idea of work play in order to understand craft workers, and we're really moving away from this distinction between amateurs and professionals. It's actually something different. It's more with motivation that drives the engagement with the craft. And so, yeah, basically for us the most important thing is symbolic capital, and we really want to emphasise this fluidity between both, and that one person can work between both and can be both a craft player and a craft worker depending on their motivation. I think that's kind of the bulk of it.
Yeah, and I suppose it's moving away from a provides greater understanding of this view that you have the musician as opposed to these segregations between this amateur and professional. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Questions, observations, impertinent comments?
Sorry for being late, I've sat my own upstairs in the wrong room. Sorry if I missed this at the start, it was so interesting, thanks so much. I see you live crossover with leisure and sport actually. There's loads about career leisure and sport, that freelance kind of in between. I was wondering what are your next steps with this, what are the implications, what do you want to do this and how would you apply it in practice?
Do you want to answer?
Yes. So we've looked at this from a lot of different perspectives. This is like the first bit of a much
I can tell there's so much in it.
It's kind of deciding where to go with it. But so just from our experiences, so as you know, Sandra's a musician. I used to do it as a job. So we were sharing experiences. So there's definitely something around gender and how gender feeds into this, both male and female. We've also got different countries, so we know that the way that you define this amateur professional in the UK is different in other countries. What's considered social capital in different countries is different. So, for example, in Denmark, if you want to be a big band, the social capital, then you have to go abroad to play. Whereas if you're in the UK, if you're a big band, then you're a tribute band. If you're in Australia, if you're a big band, then you're an originals band that plays the right venues. So the criteria is different depending on where you are. So it's about taking this model and seeing how it looks in the more global context.
And I think there's also a third layer to this model, which is the employed craft worker. So the one who, the orchestral musician, or the craft worker who works in a factory, but they have their own craft that they need for that. So there's that level. But there's also, now I've forgotten what I was going to say. So we did want to test some of this out to do with some surveys, but more looking around this intersectionality and see how our model works, especially with this idea of exploitation and hardship. So looking at that more deeply.
That's really interesting.
Anybody else? We've got a couple of reference suggestions rather than a question.
Yes,
Robert Clooney, I think, did a load of stuff around the significance of the notion of being signed or not signed, and how musicians were interpreting that or making sense of their identities through that. He was at Nottingham now, I think. And Alan Bradshaw at Royal Holloway, I'm pretty sure, did a series of interviews with Irish musicians over how they thought through and navigated the art commerce distinction. But if you didn't get them, email me and I'll tell you.
The idea of being signed or not is something that has come up in the literature and is less and less relevant.
Yeah,
because
obviously.
Because of the current.
It's
It's really interesting though.
So he did this. I can't remember if he ever published it. I remember him doing the work.
Yeah.
If he didn't, I can probably get it out of him anyway. So.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
I thought it was fascinating. You've got the theory behind why I packed it. Ladies.
Yeah, and me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that exploitation bit, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, you
And
can do
it-
this, then perhaps
Yeah.
exposure.
And that exploitation, we all know it. But doing the model, it really meant that's where it's happening.
Yeah,
And I hadn't even rationalised that before, but that's exactly where it's happening.
Yeah.
That's what they're playing.
They'll play the stage, they'll play the sound, they'll play everybody else, but they won't play the bands.
Yeah.
Come and do it, you'll get exposure.
Exposure is the big
Yeah, the big one.